Good evening. Welcome to the FDR Library. I'm Bill Harris, the director here, fortunate enough to be the director here and speaking with, where did I put it, David? You know, I've already left it somewhere. I did. I want to make sure I do my introduction of David, though he's an old friend. Well, because I wanted to especially mention your Emeritus Professorship, the Judy and Peter Kovler, I believe. And he's a good friend of the library as well. So we're very happy for you in that as well. There we go. Thank goodness for Cliff. I just need to put me out to pasture. Thanks, everybody. We'll be speaking with David tonight. I'd like to welcome C-SPAN, who are here as well, recording this, and our good friends on social media as well tonight. And we're doing this program and to mark the 80th anniversary of FDR's death. It's remarkable. The pandemic sort of made it. It was unfortunate that the 75th of VE Day and VJ Day and the president's death couldn't be honored as fulsomely maybe because of that. So it's nice to have this opportunity to have these conversations. Just a little about David, for those of you who don't know. He is the professor of history and the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation Fellow at the Roosevelt Studies at Marist University, and a senior fellow, of course, and resident of Roosevelt Institute. He's the author of The Last 100 Days. That'll form the basis of much of our conversation tonight, which was also a major part of an exhibit we did here, which had a hiatus as well because of the pandemic.
Right.
He's also written Progressivism in America and Past, Present, and Future in FDR's World War, Peace, and Legacies. You write frequently op-ed pieces. I know that we send people to you all the time. Hey, David, offer a comment. We can't. He writes reviews and articles, of course. He's a member of the scholarly board of the Gilder Lehrman Institute, also a good friend of this library, and the editorial board of the International History Review. You were most recently Fulbright in Denmark, which I know that you thoroughly enjoyed.
Yes, I did.
David, of course, is a longstanding friend of the FDR Library. He was executive director for a decade, for the Roosevelt Institute, and was here for the construction of this great building that we're in right now.
That's right, including the idea of a sunken auditorium, which we fought very hard for.
Great to have, and we appreciate that. So I don't need to read this part, that you're great and a good friend. So we don't have to do that. Thank you, David, for being here.
Thank you, Bill. And I want to thank you for inviting me to be here today, and also thank the staff of the FDR Library, and a special thanks to Cliff Laube for all his help. And nice to see so many friends and colleagues, students from Marist. We'll have a test on this next week, as well as colleagues from the history department and so forth. So it's thank you all for being here.
Definitely. And just housekeeping, like I always do, we'll talk, I don't know, probably 40 minutes or so. We'll see how the conversation's going because we could stay here all night. And though you'll bring your sleeping bags, and we don't have a pillow supply right now, budgets being what they are. And then we'll do some questions. Cards will be passed around, and you can just jot your question down, or Cliff will come around, raise your hand, and then we'll do those. And then we'll go out, and I believe you're going to favor people with signing copies of The Last 100 Days, which is good, and Mourning the President, which is, you did a chapter about the president's death. So that leads us right into the conversation. This is the 80th anniversary of the president's death. Those of us who work here, of course, and many of you have seen photographs from Yalta and in 45, have seen how the president was clearly in ill health, was clearly failing.
That's right.
What was that early spring of 1945 like for the president after Yalta?
Well, he was exhausted, and he actually was exhausted pretty much from the end of the campaign right up, I think, until the time of his death. He went down to Warm Springs shortly after the election for about 3 weeks. Then he went back to Hyde Park to celebrate Christmas. Then he had to do the inauguration. Then it was the 6 or 7 week trip to Yalta, 14,000 miles round trip.
Very difficult trip.
Very difficult trip. And then he got back to the White House. And I think, as I write about in The Last 100 Days, it was about 16 days in the middle of March was the longest period that he had been in the White House in a consecutive way. during those spring months. And then it's up to Hyde Park and back to the White House for a single day,
Just
as you
very
imagine,
briefly, yeah.
and with some very important meetings, and then off to Warm Springs. And he loved to be in Warm Springs in the springtime because you can imagine how wonderful the spring weather was, the blossoming of the peach trees in Georgia. And it's a very moving time. I always remember the extraordinary conversation that William Hassett, who was Roosevelt's secretary, White House secretary, had with Dr. Brune, who came down and traveled with Roosevelt, by the way, everywhere he went in the last 6 months or so of his life, cardiologist to keep track of his health and his heart. And Hassett was convinced that he was a dying man. He just didn't have the same oomph that he had before. And, there was this sense that Roosevelt, if he could get away, he would bounce back. And they talked about that at Yalta. He's going to go away, so he'll bounce back. And then, but it didn't happen. And then he went off to Warm Springs, and that was the hope. And Hassett pulled Dr. Brune aside on the first night they arrived and said, "Tell me the truth. What kind of condition is he in?" And Hassett did the sort of usual thing that the doctors had advised him. They had given this advice to President Roosevelt in May of 1944. Cut your workload to 4 or 5 hours a day, 6 cigarettes a day, low-fat diet, digitalis. He went back, well, the president, rests and blah, blah. And as soon as Hassett heard that, he said, that was it. I knew it was over because he knew Roosevelt wouldn't follow that regime. And so there is this sense of finality, a coming end. And then, of course, there's Easter, which is really amazing. He decides he's very tired and they never know what he's going to do. And nobody thought he was going to go to Easter service. But then, he called Arthur Prettyman into his room, his valet, and got him all dressed. And he looked very nice. And Daisy Slickley said he looked so handsome in his crimson tie. And he went off to celebrate Easter at the chapel that was built at this extraordinary facility that that he was responsible for at Warm Springs, which included this large area in front of the pulpit for gurneys and wheelchairs. The New York Times, when it was built, called it a house, a church for those who cannot kneel.
Wow.
Extraordinary stuff.
Well, let's for a second set that stage. How many of you have been to Warm Springs? Any of you been to Warm Springs? Yeah. So very few. It is a remarkable place. I'm from down there. I went to college near there and would drive over. It was familiar territory. Yeah. But it was slow paced, quiet, and it was quiet. A place for him to relax where he had found comfort. Even if he didn't find any medical benefit physically from it, you could say maybe he did. It was a place of possibility and potential and reassurance to him. Right. What is that? What is Warm Springs? Yeah, Warm Springs was a very special place for him. For those of you who haven't been there, I would urge you to go. The story behind Warm Springs is that after he had contracted infantile paralysis, or what we call polio, at the age of 39, he gets back to New York and tries to rehabilitate himself, and is reading about therapies and trying all kinds of therapies. And he had read a newspaper account of a 16-year-old boy who had traveled to this kind of ramshackle resort, half falling down in Warm Springs, Georgia, and seemed to recover the use of his legs by swimming in the warm waters of this place. So Roosevelt, he actually went down there. And it is raw. It is raw. And he, and he started, he took the waters, he got more and more interested, and eventually he bought the place, which created a real tension with his wife, Eleanor, who said, what about the children? He spent 2/3 of his personal fortune to buy this ramshackle resort and turned it into a rehabilitative center for therapy, for physical therapy for polio sufferers. And, as far as we know, it's the first center for that kind of rehabilitative medicine in the United States. Started calling himself Dr. Roosevelt.
and really loved what he was doing. And I think part of it was that he could just be himself. This is one of the great characteristics of Roosevelt that is largely hidden from the public, that he really did, at times get very tired of being what he called Exhibit A, always in the public eye, et cetera. And so Warm Springs was a place where he could be himself. And in this case, prior to his becoming president in the 1920s, he was learning how to get used to the idea that he was never going to stand or walk again.
And it's one of the few times, especially in film, that in home movies or movies that were shot down there, where you actually see him sitting in a wheelchair poolside, and you see others. He was completely safe. He felt there. He could. He didn't have to exhibit himself as virility.
As a public figure.
Who is strong, and he's the strength wasn't about that.
And it's also actually a very important period for Eleanor, because one of the things that happened was Franklin Roosevelt had an advisor by the name of Louis Howe. It's kind of this small, diminutive figure who basically, I think, smoked cigarettes 23 hours a day.
He was a little gnome of a man.
A little gnome of a man. And, wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt when he was a state senator, "My dear future Mr. President," in 1911. And really dedicated himself to promoting Roosevelt's career and had a lot of political savvy. So what he did was he turned to Eleanor, who was, somewhat shy and didn't really enjoy public speaking, but he used that period when Franklin Roosevelt was rehabilitating in Warm Springs to encourage Eleanor to keep the Roosevelt name alive. And she started speaking in public. Remember, women had just gained the right to vote in 1920, and there was this, great interest in the Democratic Party of promoting the women's wing of the party, and women were very good organizers, and she got very involved in that, particularly in the state of New York. So this is also a very ripe period for her in terms of developing her eventual writing and real political career.
So Warm Springs is a place that he can repair to rest, because that's part of it, certainly. Gather some strength, because from there the plan was to go to San Francisco.
That's right. The plan was to go to San Francisco to the opening of the San Francisco Conference, which was the conference that was going to basically draft the Charter of the United Nations. The United Nations had more or less been designed by this point. It was designed in 1944 at a conference called the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. But there were two really critical issues that had been left unresolved. One was the number of seats for the Soviet Union in the General Assembly. And the second one was this very difficult question of whether or not the 4 policemen, as Roosevelt called them, later 5 policemen, 5 permanent members of the Security Council, would have a veto. There's an awful lot of many people think that the veto was essentially there to satisfy Stalin. What they don't realize is that Roosevelt realized he would need it as well. If you think back on what happened to Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations after the close of the Versailles Treaty, and the unwillingness of the U.S. Senate to endorse U.S. involvement in the League of Nations, Roosevelt saw that as a safety valve. The difference was that, up to the Alta Conference, Stalin absolutely refused. He wanted an unlimited veto. But the Americans proposed this compromise where the great powers the 5 permanent members could veto an action, but they couldn't stop the debate. In other words, if some country wanted to take the United States to hand, or take the Soviet Union to hand, that would be aired in public and would be discussed, and there would be a vote. But the 5 permanent members had the right to veto any action that might be recommended, sending troops or whatever. And of course, that's what we have today. And I think Roosevelt was comfortable with that because he was worried about the Senate and ratification of the UN Charter.
So he's preparing. Being at Warm Springs may be restorative, but the work goes wherever the president goes. So you never. Hassett in his diary speaks of getting his papers signed. Yeah. So he would spread them. He would get the president to sign every day and spread them out to dry He
Yeah.
did that day on April 12th, I guess. It had him already sign a
Yeah.
good many things. So the rhythm of life in Warm Springs, though, is slower still, though. The work occurs, the dispatches come through,
Yeah.
but it isn't the White House.
It isn't the White House. And, I think one of the things we need to think about in terms of Roosevelt's death, and, we can talk about whether or not he should have run for a fourth term, et cetera. I'm sure that will come up. But it was a very well-oiled machine by this point. Running the war, General Marshall, the military figures, it was Admiral Leahy. These guys, these people knew what they were doing, and his secretaries, Grace Tully and so forth. They knew the rhythm. They knew the president. They knew how to work with him. So it actually is the case that his workday is diminishing in Warm Springs, and typically he would work in the late morning with Hassett, get everything signed. The one thing that was not included in the book, and this is not in any way a knock against my publisher, I was very graciously happy that they printed, I think, 5 or 6 images in this book and a number of maps. But the one really fascinating thing to look at is his signature at the end of his life. It is just, you can tell. You see this vigorous signature of this younger man, and then you see it at Warm Springs in those last weeks, and he's barely able to scribble.
Yeah. And he's brought with him on this trip for company and entertainment,
Absolutely.
companionship, 2 cousins of his,
Yes.
Laura Delano, who lived between here and, I guess, in Statsburg, between here and Rhinebeck, and was a dog breeder and eccentric with a sharp tongue and purple hair, I believe, or blue, but not like blue hair, but blue. And his other cousin, Daisy Swookley,
That's right.
with Wilderson, just up Route 9 from here, who was also one of the first staff members here at the library.
That's right.
So what was, and of course, Fala.
Yeah, Fala, absolutely.
What was that relationship as part of the day? Entertainment, helping him along to relax?
Absolutely, to help him to relax. I write in the book that there were very few people with whom Franklin Roosevelt could relax, and that included his wife. She was more like a political advisor. She was a major figure in her own right. She was writing her My Day column day after day, 6 days a week. And she had many issues that were close to her heart that she wanted to discuss with the president. And she had a memo box, at his bedside that she would put memos in at night. And I do write about the one scene of tension between the two of them during the so-called children's hour. Every day at 5 o'clock, Roosevelt had to stop everything and have his cocktail hour. And they called it the children's hour. And he absolutely forbid anybody to bring any kind of work issue into that moment. He so needed it to rest. And there was this occasion in that last period of his life where Eleanor came into children's hours with a bunch of papers and put them down in front of him, and he actually threw them across the table and asked his daughter to take care of it for him. A rare public sort of display of tension between the two of them. But no, Roosevelt, Harry Hopkins was another one. Mackenzie King, these were people that some of these advisors, like Hopkins, knew when it was time to shut it off, and so Roosevelt could relax with Hopkins. But he enjoyed the company of women. He liked people to adore him, and especially women. And he would carry on and tell his jokes and tell his stories. And
Hassett was brilliant at listening to the stories.
Yeah.
He recounts in the diary, just listening, and he's recounting these stories. And I think that's savvy.
Yeah.
Probably interesting, but certainly savvy too, because the people who didn't fare as well, it would seem.
Yeah, exactly. And this was his way of relaxing. He's not carrying on, affairs with these people and things like that. They are simply there to help him relax. And Daisy Swookley is a very important person in his life. And, Eleanor Roosevelt was so busy with her causes and traveling and so forth that she frequently asked Daisy to stay with the president. And, these scenes that you can't imagine. Remember, this is a man in a wheelchair. He's in his second floor study in the White House having lunch on a tray, and Daisy's there with him. And sometimes she's just sitting knitting in the room, so he's not alone. I think.
Or labeling the back of photographs that are here at this library.
Yes.
And the reason they're identified is because she would sit with him.
Yeah.
And she would
Label a photograph.
label everyone on
Yeah,
them.
she was very devoted to him. So it's an interesting place, and this is, of course, where he would bring an entourage with him, usually a small one, and they would go for drives in the afternoon, almost on a daily basis.
And the staff, it was an opportunity for them to catch their breath a little bit too.
Absolutely.
There's a little diary. I'm writing a piece that'll be online, I hope, tomorrow. Just about the way that the papers and records here and some of the less well-known, say, people recorded, or how that moment was captured of his death. And Louise Hackmeister, the telephone operator who would come down and run communications, is recording. They get some sun, they can sunbathe, relax a little more, get a little more sleep.
Yeah, and go to the pool, which is a big
absolutely.
deal. Yeah.
And so you're seeing just this rhythm of life in Warm Springs. The house in Warm Springs is simple. It's not either a large house or a fancy house.
Yeah, I mean his bedroom is about the size of this carpet. It's and it empties right out onto the living room. And then, again, these were very simple folks, the Roosevelts. They were not ostentatious, and he loved that little cottage, and he loved the balcony or the
view
porch on the back that he could see the pine forest and so forth.
One of the later pictures of him is one of the last pictures of him, isn't it?
It's on the Grace Tully, sitting in the sun.
So
April 11th.
So on the 11th is fascinating for a host of reasons. Henry Morgenthau comes to visit.
That's right.
And his account of that visit is striking.
Yeah.
And detailed.
Yeah.
And painful to read.
Yeah.
And he stayed for dinner. He came to discuss business, of course. Flew down just for that, had dinner.
Yeah.
Visited for a while and flew back.
Yeah.
And then sat down and recorded everything that had occurred.
Yeah. It is an amazing conversation. That one of the things that strikes me about that conversation is, Roosevelt tells Morgenthau, he's very, focused on the United Nations conference coming up in a couple of weeks. And he told Morgenthau, and this is what I really found fascinating, that he decided he was going to go there for the first day, and he was going to address the delegates, and he was going to do it from his wheelchair. And, he said, I'm going to do it from a wheelchair. And, it's, and Morgenthau talks about how, frail and pale he is.
And that it was painful that his hands shook so much
he
that
pour the drinks.
Couldn't pour the cocktails. And he had never seen him struggle so much to move from his chair from his wheelchair to his chair. And yet he was still in that condition. Until I came here and had actually read that, would have never imagined he was still moving himself from one place to another because he looked so gaunt and weak. But he was. But then as the conversation and dinner goes on, you see Roosevelt emerge.
Yeah, it kind of picks up. Yeah. And especially when he starts talking about the UN. Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating then when he clearly looked ill. He clearly was very ill. And people close to him knew he wasn't. He was a shadow in a way of his former self. And yet the next day, well, wait a minute before we get to the next day. There are other guests there as well.
Oh, of course.
How could I pass that over? Who else has been visiting Warm Springs?
Lucy Mercer Rutherford is there. Lucy is, and I'm probably the only historian that uses this word, but now students pay attention. She is the woman that he had an alleged affair with in 1918 at the end of World War I. That Eleanor discovered this package of love letters between the two of them. My argument on this is whether or not they had some kind of physical relationship was kind of immaterial. The fact is that very important bond that Eleanor had with him in terms of their intellectual relationship and everything else was broken by that discovery. Remember, this is a woman who had a very unhappy childhood, lost her mother at age 8, her father to alcoholism, I think when she was 11, had to be raised by her grandmother. And, had spent a good deal of her life trying to build her confidence and gain strength. this was a major, major blow.
Mhm.
And what I think transpires as a consequence is a kind of rebuilding of their marriage into, because I do think they still loved each other right till the
I
end.
think so,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah. And
You
enjoyed,
see it in you do see it in the papers, even in little ways.
yeah, little
They're-
ways.
Yeah, they're not,
He was,
yeah, I agree
he was
completely.
very excited, for example, in the last 100 days about going to England. There was this talk of his going to England in June. Churchill was very excited about it. And he had this long conversations with Eleanor about buying new clothes, and she could look really great, and wouldn't it be wonderful? And at Christmas time, he spoke to one of his sons. I think it might have been Elliot. I can't remember, but or maybe it was James. But he kind of lamented the fact that that he and Eleanor hadn't been able to spend more time together and things like that. So you do see these little snippets of comments that indicate that there was still strong affection between them. But Lucy was also a person one of those people with whom Roosevelt could relax. And so in the spring of 1944, when Anna Eleanor Roosevelt was living in the White House, she is the one who noticed the decline in his health. He came back from the Tehran conference. He caught bronchitis. He couldn't seem to shake it. There actually were reports in the press about his health and so forth. And she's the one, and Eleanor was concerned too, but Anna was the one who insisted that he had to see, like a team of doctors. And because of this, you have these naval physicians and Dr. Leahy from Boston, a major famous surgeon, and Dr. Bruin, the cardiologist, the young naval cardiologist. And they determined that Franklin Roosevelt was suffering from congestive heart failure and hypertension. And, this is shattering news.
No cure.
Right.
Nothing.
And so this is the beginning of this process to try to shield him from overwork. And Anna played a big role in that, particularly at the Yalta conference. So I bring up Anna because Anna was the one who assisted in inviting Lucy to the White House to see him, because
she had a home as well in South Carolina.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so
she had married.
That's right. She had married. So again, this is something that, I think is fascinating and of course needs to be understood, that his own daughter was worried about his health, knew that he needed to relax, and thought that visits with Lucy would be good for him. And so, of course, she would only do it when Eleanor was out of town, but Eleanor was out of town often. And so Lucy did go to the White House. They would take drives together, and then
she came to the library once.
Yeah, so, that's right. And he was very proud to show off the library.
In our daily log from the director's secretary, it's just FDR, an unidentified woman.
Yeah. And then they used the
and
term,
they knew who she was, Mrs. Van Kuren, Miss Van Kuren.
Yeah, I think she did come before 1944, but the visits really started much more frequently. And so she was invited to Warm Springs. And the correspondence between her and Grace Tully is fascinating, because they're actually corresponding about whether it would be a good idea or not a good idea in terms of his health. They're both terribly worried about his health. Ultimately, they decide that she should come, and of course, she brings along this artist.
Well, she brings someone who might have been bad for his health, Madame Shumatov, who is, if anything, a colorful character. Russian emigre. Of
artist.
Yes, and portraitist.
Yeah.
Noted society portraitist.
That's right. And she's the one who's responsible for those final photographs of Franklin Roosevelt, because she wanted these photographs taken so she could work up them on this portrait she was working on. But Hassett found her enormously irritating. She was bothering the president. He needed rest, and then he agreed to sit and he was trying to look at papers while he was sitting. He just thought it was outrageous. But
he apparently, as a sitter, was hit or miss in terms, because he couldn't be still. That wasn't really his way. He wanted to be talking or something, or doing his papers. But Madame Shumatov, maybe it was the Russian in her, but was rather direct about what she expected. In order to get her sketches done.
And so this is the scene down there. The last 48 hours or more of his life. It's in some ways it's interesting, because we do have these photographs where you really see how how much he has declined.
Yeah, and it is dramatic.
It's dramatic. Yeah, it's like his signature. You can really see the difference. And then you can imagine, of course, the scene when he actually does pass away and how she has to leave and right away and so forth.
It was so quick, really, in real terms.
Yeah.
He's reviewing documents. Madame Shumatov is at work. Daisy Suckley and Laura Delano are nearby.
Yeah. Daisy's probably knitting. Laura brought her dogs. You can imagine the scene. And this room is, again, the room itself, the living room is, again, probably the size of this stage. It's not a very big house.
I think Hassett had some papers drying.
Yeah.
The ink drying on signatures.
Yeah.
And then it's very sudden.
Yeah. And, he's sitting there and he reaches up to the back of his head, I think he reached down, he dropped either a cigarette or a paper, and then he started to lean down and then reached up to the back of his head and said he had a terrible headache. And that's when Daisy jumped up and asked him what was going on.
Her description is striking to me because of it. He was confused. He was clearly in pain, and something was wrong. They knew immediately.
Yeah, they knew immediately
something was wrong.
And then his valet, Arthur Friedemann, and the Joe Esposito, who was a Filipino house worker that was in the White House, but also at Warm Springs, carried him into his room. And, and he was unconscious, labored breathing. And, this set off all kinds of alarms. And Dr. Bruin was up at the pool, and they had to get him down there as fast as possible. So it's just a scene of intense motion. In the book, I describe how, these people some of them are all scattering because they have to scatter. Of course, Lucy Mercer doesn't know if he's dead or alive, and she's frantically trying to find out. And, an hour or two later when she's driving.
Yeah, because they get in she
car.
And Madame Shumatov and get in the car and off they go.
Yeah.
And they hear on the radio.
They hear on the radio. And so it's this very dramatic moment. And of course that day was the day that he was supposed to go up to this barbecue.
Yes.
And everybody was ready for it, and the Secret Service were ready, and so forth. So you can imagine the scene was just.
And that's where the press largely was getting ready at the barbecue, weren't they?
That's right. That's right. So it is this very dramatic scene, and Bruin comes in and gives him a shot of adrenaline right into his heart, and calls the White House. And Dr. McIntyre was the White House physician, the Surgeon General of the United States. They got a hold of another physician in Atlanta who drove over at 100 miles an hour and got there within an hour or so. But at 3:30, his heart stopped, and that was it. He'd lost consciousness shortly after the incident. So, suddenly the president is gone. And
the world is connected through a telephone?
To the telephone.
Maybe
not the internet.
Yeah. And so they call the White House. Of course, Steve Early, his press secretary, was in Washington.
Yeah.
Had not made the trip.
Yeah. And it was a good thing in a way.
It probably was when you think.
Yeah, because Early had lived through, Pearl Harbor. He'd been through a number of these kind of crises, and he sort of locked everything down and created a sense of order in terms of how this was going to roll out and who should be called first. And of course, the first person they called was Eleanor Roosevelt. She had been called earlier to say that he had fainted, and that they would keep her appraised of this. But then within a short time later, after that phone call, she got the word that he had died, and she, of course, went to the White House immediately, and that's where she came into the room, and there was Harry Truman, and she, where he immediately expressed his condolences, and she famously said, "It's not me that you should express condolence. It's you who are.
We're here for you. You're carrying
the
this
one
burden
who is
now.
Really in trouble now." And then there is this very charming statement that she issued. She had to send a telegram to her sons who are scattered across the world because they're all in the service, and one in the Philippines, and Elliot's in the UK, and so forth. It's just this extraordinary moment. And what's really particularly interesting about the whole scene that unfolds over the next couple of days, she has to go to Warm Springs, Steve Early, and she fly down there. That's where she learns from Laura Delano,
Yeah.
who had a very mean streak that Lucy Mercer
didn't like her, Eleanor
No.
Roosevelt anyway.
and told her that Lucy Mercer was there, so she learns this right before she's about to walk into the bedroom to greet her, see her husband, roughly at the same time. And, it's just, it's a very striking moment. But what's really fascinating, though, is the way, James Roosevelt had come back for the fourth inaugural. FDR had this tradition. He always wanted James, his eldest son, to be there. And if you look at all these inaugural photographs, it's very tall, handsome James, usually standing behind the president. And in the 100 Days, I describe how, after the inauguration, Roosevelt sort of leaves the family to deal with the thousands of guests and all this, and he wants to retire to his room. He does have a little reception, which included, by the way, a famous opera singer who also had polio, who had sort of rehabilitated her career. Things like that you wouldn't expect on this particular day. But eventually, they retire alone to his study, and he says to James that he wants to talk about his will, and that he's going to be one of the executors of the will, and says he wants to give him his family ring and all this. And James says, well, of course, this is not going to happen soon. And, but you have this sense that Roosevelt is keenly aware of his own mortality. And he wrote out the instructions for his funeral. Were placed in his safe in an envelope with James's name on the front. And
He also, this is fascinating to us, of all the ship models that would come here to this library while he was alive, the Constitution, of course, always stayed close to him. You see it pictured, and he had made arrangements for it to be brought up here.
Wow.
So
yeah, that's very interesting.
It's very curious,
I didn't know that.
little things.
Things. Yeah.
And the will is a big thing, but the little symbolic things, you wonder.
Yeah, and there was this moment again in the last 100 Days where he suddenly burst out and said to Grace Tully, and I can't remember the other secretary who was in the room, "What in this room would you like to keep in remembrance of me?" And pick something out. And these little subtle hints. But anyway, what this means is that Eleanor Roosevelt literally, had no instructions for how to organize the funeral, and because the envelope was addressed to James, she refused to open it. And James is desperately trying to get back, but he's in the Philippines on duty. He does get back, but he gets back too late. He gets back just in time to get to the Rose Garden. And so she has to kind of, you can imagine the burden on her. She has to figure out what to do. And thank goodness, one person who was notified very early on, and this is what I meant when you talk about a well-oiled machine, was General Marshall. And he immediately went to the White House, immediately went to express his condolences to Mrs. Roosevelt. And she asked him for help in organizing the service, the funeral for her, the president. And that was it.
Yeah.
The Army took over, thousands of troops lining the road from Warm Springs to the train station, thousands and thousands of Americans lining the street or lining the railway tracks as the train brought his body back to Washington. And then this enormous military sort of parade, through Washington with an estimated 500,000 people.
Color footage of it from Union Station down to the White House. That's striking. You should watch
and
it.
It's just this extraordinary scene, including B-17 bombers and waves of troops, various troops, including women's Army troops. And I don't normally do this, but could I read a little
absolutely, because that's a great passage.
This description of the funeral I remembered today, and I just thought, this is amazing. So at 4:00 in the afternoon, the funeral service was to begin in the East Room of the White House, which Franklin didn't want. He wanted service in the church. And this is what I wrote in Mourning the President. At 4 p.m., the hour at which the services in the East Room were set to begin, the nation and much of the world paused for a moment of silence in tribute to the late president. In an extraordinary display of national unity, virtually everything came to a sudden halt at the appointed moment. Throughout New York City, millions stood in utter silence on the pavement in what the New York Times reported as an outpouring of mass sorrow and reverence seldom witnessed in American life. In the tunnels, in the train tunnels underneath, subway trains came to a halt. Passengers stood to their feet or bowed their heads. In Chicago, Los Angeles, and other cities, normally busy inner city, bustling inner city centers became deathly quiet. Radios everywhere went silent. War production halted in defense plants. Western Union ceased transmitting telegrams. Newspaper presses stopped printing. Even telephone service was interrupted. Overseas, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, many of whom felt that the loss of FDR was like losing their own father, paused for 5 minutes of silent prayer. Theaters and cabarets closed in France, pubs went silent in the United Kingdom, while in the Soviet Union, ordinary citizens wept as they viewed special newsreels featuring the late president. So in virtually every country in the world, there was this mass outpouring of grief.
The condolence materials here are, and I'm going to highlight some of those online too in the next couple of weeks, are remarkable. From interspersed with a soldier in France somewhere or Germany is a telegram from a head of state, and personal.
Yeah,
not,
very personal.
Not so formal, very personal. So let's see if there are any questions. And we can make the note too that though those around him may have seen him failing, the shock of that radio announcement that afternoon, it was Thursday afternoon, I think.
Yeah.
Thursday afternoon. Flash, the president is dead, was a tremendous shock to people who did not expect that. Okay, thank you for the question. Did FDR display to his acquaintances any personal sense of achievement regarding the ending war in Europe? That's always, I think that's a great question. Was he aware that victory was near us? And I'm going to add to that because the commentary and the way even we speak about it sometimes is, there's this tragic notion he didn't live to see the victory that he had really in many ways given his life for. What do we think?
It's a very interesting question, and actually it's one that I address both in the 100 Days and in Mourning the President, because in many respects Roosevelt is like Lincoln. Mm-hmm. He's a war president who dies during the war, although Lincoln, immediately afterwards. And there's this, again, a quote from Winston Churchill when he's paying tribute to FDR after his death in London. He says that, although the president's death comes as a bitter blow to humanity, mm-hmm. he died an enviable death in battle harness, like his soldiers, sailors, and airmen. When victory, when the beam of victory or something like mm-hmm. that, the sure beam of victory had its steady beam mm-hmm. upon him or something. Again, you can imagine Churchillian mm-hmm. language, but it's really true. This, in a sense, this contributes to his legacy in terms of his awareness of the end of the war. I think he was aware it was coming to an end. I think Americans have a misconception about where things were in January of 1945. We think, oh, the war's over. Mm-hmm. It was not over by any stretch, particularly in Germany. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. When Roosevelt shows up at Yalta, Stalin's like, "Where are you guys?"
Yeah.
We had hardly, we didn't cross the Rhine until the 23rd of March in any meaningful way. But there was this momentum that built after that. And I think by this point, by the early April, things had gotten to the point where they knew that the end was coming. And he is talking about going to England mm-hmm. In June. Yeah,
which he had never visited. He never
visited. And very excited about it. He also, by the way, this is another strange aspect of Roosevelt's final days. He was fascinated by the Middle East, and he really had this idea that he could, help turn the Middle East into a garden. He read the book Palestine, Land of Promise by Walter Clay Loudermilk, and he talked to Eleanor about, I could resign as president. and we could go to the Middle East. There's water over there. We could, and,
He was probably, there he goes again.
yeah, there he goes again. But it's a good question, and I think I do think he was aware that the end was
Certainly.
coming. But don't
And-
forget, we had the war in the
Well,
Pacific.
that's the difference, right? The war against Japan, certainly, unless there had been one of these miracle weapons at the last minute of the Germans, that was the fear, or that the Germans would continue through a redoubt fighting in southern Germany.
Yeah,
but
nobody was absolutely 100%.
But it
But
was
they
pretty
were-
certain.
they were
3 weeks
getting-
later, it would be over there.
Yeah.
And so next, do you believe if President Roosevelt survived to see the end of the war, that he would have had similar goals to President Truman, like creating the Marshall Plan? Well, you know what? That's an interesting point. The Marshall Plan alone afterwards, considering what Henry Morgenthau was talking to him about on the 11th, which is ensuring that Germany has no industrial capacity and is totally incapable of ever even functioning as a nation again.
Yeah.
So what about that in the post-war world, which was right there?
Yeah, I think that the name of the Morgenthau Plan, the formal name, is the plan to prevent World War III. And again, I think that
it's dramatic.
It's dramatic, and I think what many Americans don't realize is that the big fear in World War II was not, there was a growing sense of alarm about Soviet power. That's quite clear and obvious, and it was there practically throughout the conflict. But the biggest fear was the fear of a resurgent Germany. That was the big fear. And even Winston Churchill, who was such a rabid anti-communist, certainly before the war, recognized that Soviet power could be very important in maintaining, and that's why, again, we admire the United Nations, and it's fascinating. You look at the sketch that Roosevelt made of the United Nations, which is in the library, has 3 little circles, the General Assembly, the Secretariat that would run it, and then the 4 policemen. And he shows this to Stalin on the end of November 1943 at the Tehran Conference. And underneath the General Assembly, he writes WHO, World Health Organization, ILO, International Labor Organization, food, World Food Program. So he clearly was thinking along the social and economic lines. But as he said to Anne O'Hare McCormick in this amazing interview he gave just a few weeks before he died in the White House, as she took down, what he was really looking forward to was the creation of the United Nations and the armed security system to maintain the peace. And that's the 4 policemen. So, again, we're in the middle of a war, a terribly violent war in the Pacific, in Europe. And, the possibility of, and for that generation, Germany was in many respects viewed as a thrice aggressive power, 1870, 71, 1914, and now 1939. And there was a society in New York called the Prevention of World War III. It was dedicated to stopping Germany from rising again. So these are the issues that are, channeling through the White House, channeling through Roosevelt at the end of the war, while at the same time you have the most contentious, difficult period with the Soviet Union, with Joseph Stalin in the wake of the Yalta Conference, over Poland, over Soviet treatment of Eastern Europe, and so forth and so on. Roosevelt was patient. He knew that the Soviet Union would require massive rebuilding when the war was over. And I think his hope, again, being an optimist, is that, the socialism of the Soviet Union would ameliorate over time. And we could encourage that through the military aid and so forth that was needed.
And there's no equivocation to it. It's absolute in many ways. It's absolute as anything can be, that the United States was ending the war as the single most powerful nation in the world.
That's right. And, again, going back to this question of what would have happened had he lived, again, I think many people don't realize that the Marshall Plan was offered to the Soviet Union. and the Marshall Plan was offered to Eastern Europe. But the Marshall Plan was offered to Germany. And the idea that the Russians, remember, 25 million dead. We had 400 more Russians died in the Battle of Stalingrad than the total combined casualties of the British and the Americans in the entire Second World War. So the idea of any kind of resurgent Germany was incomprehensible to them. So this is what really begins this tension between the two. And I think if Roosevelt had been alive, maybe that situation would have been handled with more finesse. I don't know. But the truth is that Truman really kind of got off to a bad start with the Russians. They didn't respect him the way they respected Roosevelt. He brought in Jimmy Burns, who was very much an anti.
I believe Morgenthau was against that as well.
Yeah, and so, there are these circumstances that just things have changed, and so we don't know what would happen if Roosevelt had lived.
The world had indeed changed. One more question, and then one more question. I think we've got good time for that. And this is interesting because it goes to something we sort of touched on earlier. How much access did the press have to FDR at Warm Springs? As much access as FDR wanted them to have.
As much access. Although he, we can argue about this now. This is the director. I'm the historian.
That's right. Very different roles here.
Because the official line is that he had 997 press conferences, but in my book, I think I say this in my book, I always argue he had 998 because he had one at Warm Springs. It was only 2 reporters, but it was still a press conference.
I'll cede the ground.
And it was interesting because it included the new president of the Philippines, who was in the United States for health reasons. Quezon, he came up to Warm Springs to see Roosevelt, and Roosevelt, being the political man he was, he brought him into the press conferences and talked about anti-colonialism and the freedom that the Filipinos were going to enjoy within a matter of a year and so forth. And it was the kind of way that he could segue into some of these post-war questions that were happening. Roosevelt's relationship with the press is really extraordinary. 2 press conferences a week for 12 years, 997 according to the library, 998 according to me. And, he handled these himself. He did have rules, and he did have the first press secretary, that was Steve Early, who was there during these press conferences. And, he's sitting in his chair. These guys are like on his desk, and he's fielding the questions left, right, and center. He talked a lot off the record. Because he wanted to educate the press on what he was thinking, what he was doing. The rules were that if there was something you could quote, Early was there to make sure that whatever you quoted the president was saying, that it was absolutely correct. So I think the press really had a very good relationship. Roosevelt, as far as the press was concerned, he liked the reporters. He didn't always like the editors.
Well, he certainly didn't like the publishers.
The publishers. That's what I meant to say.
Some of the editors, for that matter.
Yeah, the Chicago Tribune, for example, was not a paper that he was very fond of. So, but yeah, it's an extraordinary relationship, and what's also interesting is the respect that they had for him. In that spring of 1944, when he was ill, there was reporting in the press, and there were questions about how healthy he was. And Dr. McIntyre was the one, who, his personal physician, who gave out the standard line, "He's as healthy as a man could be for a man of his age." And the public, by the way, knew that he had a disability. They just didn't know the extent of his disability, and they certainly didn't know that he used a wheelchair. That was not known at all.
Well, no, we could have a disagreement on that too.
Yeah, that's true. This Teamster's speech, he was wheeled out. There are these really rare equations,
that's
but
right.
again,
you see it in
and you actually do see it in the press occasionally.
Not a lot, but you do see it.
You do see it. And I found it in the book, and it is in there, so I ought to be careful about saying. But I think that respect translated into, again, a willingness to understand that he didn't want to focus on his disability, and probably to a certain extent, maybe a willingness to believe that he could carry on. Although in October of 1944, There were all kinds of press reports.
A lot of
A
press
vote for Roosevelt's a vote for Truman. This health should be an issue in this campaign. Public has a right to know, this kind of thing. So there were growing concerns, growing alarm. You know how Roosevelt put a stop to all this. Hassett was very worried in the summer of 1944 because he just didn't seem into it. He wasn't interested in campaigning. He didn't want to campaign. And everybody thought, well, he's really lost it. Until the Fala speech, the famous speech where he's accused of sending Fala back to Alaska at a cost of
getting a battleship to
$3 or $4 or $30 million to bring back his dog. And then, that people are already laughing in this audience. And he says, well, I don't resent a tax. And my wife doesn't resent a tax, nor does my family. But Fala's a Scotch. And he does resent it.
Well, let's close on Fala. Let's end on a note that's bittersweet, but also speaks to even great leaders are humans. And a dog lover. I used to own a cat, so don't just hold it. But I'm a dog person now.
Yeah.
But after the president died. Let's close on Fala, reacting to the president's death.
Yeah, there are all these photographs and even film footage of just this very dejected Fala. One famous one with Arthur Prettyman taking him out of Warm Springs, looking very morose. And then the actual funeral itself in Washington, Fala is present there, and the public. He had become very much a public figure. He was part of this sort of Roosevelt world that the public had enjoyed. There was a great deal of
press about that. Yeah. He howled when the volleys were fired here at the funeral.
That was very famous that he howled at the funeral. Yeah.
So, well, we could keep going. We didn't even get to talk about impact of the way that was felt in this nation at that moment in time.
I can say one thing.
Say one thing.
In 1998, Time magazine asked the preeminent historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. To reflect on sort of the most important aspects of the 20th century, and he responded with a simple comment. He said, "Take a look at our present world. It's not Adolf Hitler's world. His 1,000-year Reich lasted but a brief and bloody 10 years. It's not Joseph Stalin's world. That world, collapsed before our very eyes. It's not Winston Churchill's world. Empire and all its glories have long since vanished into history. The world we live in today is Franklin Roosevelt's world."
Well, let's close on that note. And thank you, David, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.